You're probably already quite familiar with the story of the build-up to the First World War. An arms race, colonial rivalries, military mobilization, and the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in no particular order. But one aspect of the prologue to this global epoch that is sometimes overlooked were a series of telegrams sent between two cousins who, as it turns out, happen to be two of the most powerful men in the world. These are, of course, the Willy-Nicky telegrams, a series of urgent personal communications between Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, both of whom happen to be cousins, affectionately addressing each other as Willie and Nicky. Their correspondence, spanning the literal days leading up to the Great War's outbreak, was a desperate attempt to prevent a looming global catastrophe. The letters begin with a plea from Tsar Nicholas, who rightfully feared that the escalating crisis over the assassination of Franz Ferdinand of Austria by a Bosnian Serb terrorist could soon spiral into a full-scale war. Nicholas wrote to Kaiser Wilhelm, saying, "I foresee that very soon I shall be overwhelmed by the pressure forced upon me and be forced to take extreme measures which will lead to war. To try and avoid such a calamity as a European war, I beg you, in the name of our old friendship, to do what you can to stop your allies from going too far. Yours, Nicky." Wilhelm then replied, in a much less forgiving tone, that immediate, affirmative, clear, and unmistakable answer from the Russian government is the only way to avoid endless misery. Until I have received this answer, alas, I am unable to discuss the subject of your telegram. Yours, Willie. It doesn't take a detective to figure out that beneath these words lay a massive mycelium of mistrust and anxiety. Both monarchs, regardless of their familial ties with one another, were under pressure from their respective governments and militaries. Nicholas himself acknowledged this and is quoted as saying, "I do not rule Russia, 10,000 clerks do," while Kaiser Wilhelm and his general staff were already preparing for der Tag, or the day, for nearly a decade. By 1908, the Germans already had a perfect strategy for war with Belgium and France, and Wilhelm seemed to have become sincerely dislodged from any notion of peace on the continent, expressing this sentiment, rather crudely, with the quote, "lunch in Paris, dinner in St. Petersburg." We also can't forget that the other powers of Europe, most notably France, were eager to go to war as well. France was reeling from their defeat at the hands of Germany in 1871, and England sought to prevent the Germans from building a rival fleet to the British Navy. Needless to say, by the time the two rulers were exchanging telegrams, the factors which sparked the First World War, nationalism, militarism, imperialism, and the web of alliances that snagged all of the major European powers, all pointed to the inevitability of conflict. As the telegrams continued and the clock ticked closer to August of 1914, it became clear that both Wilhelm and Nicholas had lost control over their own governments. In the end, the Willy-Nicky telegrams simply failed. They could not bridge the chasm of distrust and deferring national interests that had been deepened over years of diplomatic and military maneuvering. The machinery of war had already been set in motion, and the good intentions of two monarchs, though possibly sincere, were powerless to stop it. On the 1st of August 1914, Germany declared war on Russia. It was but one declaration in the tidal wave pulling nation after nation into what would become the First World War, a conflict that would devastate an entire generation and reshape the world in ways that neither Willie nor Nicky could have imagined. But what if that had changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, somehow, the Willy-Nicky telegrams actually worked? Before beginning today's alternate history scenario, be sure to leave a comment and subscribe. If you want to contribute to these scenarios or just have ideas you'd like to have made into videos, consider becoming a channel member or supporting us on Patreon. Thanks, and enjoy the video. Alright, so this premise is very obviously unrealistic. That much is certain, as we genuinely have to hand-wave away all of the factors that thrust Russia and Germany against each other, not to mention the fact that the ruling classes and military establishments of both empires were dead set on going to war. So I ask of you all to suspend your disbelief, as we're just going to have fun with this scenario and treat it more as a narrative rather than a genuine historical hypothetical. So the Willy-Nicky telegrams magically work. What happens next? Obviously, this is no grand alliance like the League of Three Emperors. Rather, it is a pragmatic agreement, something like the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, but of the First World War. With Russia bound by a non-aggression pact, Austria-Hungary would move even swifter and harder against Serbia, emboldened by the knowledge that the Russian bear would remain in its den. Serbia would put up fierce resistance, but the Habsburg and Imperial German armies would have a chokehold over the Serbs and Montenegrins within a year. The Slavic world would be watching in horror as Russia, once the protector of Orthodox Christians and Slavs, stood by in silence. Nicholas's military establishment would feel the same hot iron of betrayal, as their leader, who they believed to have been squarely in alignment with their aims, maneuvered to undermine their war goals. Dissent simmered among the Russian military hierarchy. Not once could they have imagined that they would be sidelined like so, especially after partial Russian mobilization. Russia's influence in the Balkans, painstakingly built over decades, had in effect evaporated overnight. That perennial powder keg of Europe continued to hem on the brink of chaos. Bulgaria, eager to carve out a greater share of the region's spoils, would end its policy of strict and loyal neutrality and join the side of the Austrians and Germans, invading southern Serbia in order to realize the Bulgarian Tsar's territorial aims for a greater Bulgaria. At the same time, informal Greek involvement was escalating. Greece was in an interesting predicament, and its government was fiercely debating whether or not to trigger the Greco-Serbian military alliance. Some of the Greek elites saw involvement in the Austro-Serbian War as an unnecessary burden, though many of the elites also held deep religious, diplomatic, and economic ties to Serbia. Greece's government ruled that it would remain neutral unless the Bulgarians invaded Serbia in order to maintain the region's balance of power, but upon Bulgaria's invasion, the Greeks actually ruled again to remain neutral, and, in our timeline, failed to formally join the war until 1917. When the Allies installed a new government in the aftermath of the Greek political crisis. But that didn't mean the Greeks weren't fighting prior to 1917. Greek elites and military commanders actually disobeyed the government in Athens and launched informal campaigns to defend the Serbs. Greek civilians living along the Serbian and Bulgarian borders also occasionally took up arms, sometimes to attack Bulgarian soldiers, but other times in self-defense. In our alternate timeline, this informal Greek involvement on the side of Serbia would lead to a full-scale Bulgarian invasion of Greek Macedonia. By now, the Austrian, German, and Bulgarian armies had met in the city of Niš and marched towards Kosovo-Polje, while remnants of the Serbian army fled to the Albanian mountains. Now, Austria-Hungary had, along with Bulgaria, consolidated its grip on the Balkans, and the repercussions of Russia's retreat from the region became crystal clear. The Slavic peoples of the Balkans would now need to look elsewhere for protection. The balance of power in Europe was shifting, and the consequences of this new order would soon be felt far beyond the borders of Serbia and Macedonia. The Ottoman Empire, watching this war unfold with cautious eyes, hesitated to commit to the growing conflict. The sick man of Europe had long been under the yoke of one-sided economic treaties imposed by European powers, treaties that strangled its economy and limited its sovereignty. The Ottoman Empire was, in effect, an agricultural state in a world of industrial warfare, and the Balkan Wars had only weakened its economy further. Sultan Mehmed V needed a way to quickly reinvigorate his dying nation, and to his advisory council, a short and easily winnable war in the Balkans would be the most obvious choice. The need to jumpstart their economy and reclaim their lost influence would drive the Ottomans to join the Bulgarians and open a second Greek front in the war. The Hellenes, now forced to formally acknowledge the devastating coalition war on their doorstep, would plead to the great powers of the West for assistance, while the Ottomans, aiming to capture and fortify the Aegean Islands, now, for the first time in years, saw a chance to expand their territory rather than lose it, most especially with the comforting absence of the Russian threat on their eastern frontier. But the gamble came with significant risks. The British Empire, although not a direct participant in the conflict, at least for now, loomed large over the Ottoman Empire, surrounding it from both sides. By January of 1916, Serbia had finally capitulated, and with the Germans and Austrians seeking not to find themselves roped into a conflict in Greece, a treaty was signed between Germany, Austria, Bulgaria, and Serbia, formally ending the Austro-Serbian War. Under the terms of this treaty, Austria-Hungary solidified its control over Serbia and Montenegro. This allowed Bosnia to be further integrated into the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but these gains came at a heavy price. The internal problems of Austria-Hungary, which had sparked this war in the first place, only worsened. The swift victory in Serbia had not brought the peace and stability the Habsburgs had hoped for. Instead, it exacerbated the already simmering tensions within the empire. The Slavic populations, who had once looked to Russia as their protector, now found themselves under the thumb of a dual monarchy that showed little regard for their aspirations. Nationalism, that powerful and unpredictable force, began to tear at the very fabric of the Habsburg Empire, as the ethnic Serbs became a proverbial lion backed into a corner. These weren't the only changes that came from the treaty, however. Bulgaria, having obviously sided with the Austrians, was rewarded with the annexation of southern Serbia, including the coveted region of Macedonia. With these and occupied Greek Macedonia now under Bulgarian control, the Bulgarian Tsar found himself in a favorable position to strike a swift blow against the Greeks and end the second front in this war before it could slow to a stalemate. Throughout this period, the Western powers were closely watching the events in the Balkans, trying to guess whether or not the conflict would spill over, as many of the Balkan wars had before. In France, the mood was one of outrage and frustration. French revanchists who desperately wanted to take Alsace-Lorraine from Germany saw Russia's inaction as a betrayal of sorts. The opportunity to strike at Germany to reclaim lost honor and territory had slipped through their fingers. Britain, while also wary of German power due to the ongoing naval arms race, was less focused on the missed opportunity for war and more concerned with the shifting balance of power in the Balkans and Eastern Mediterranean. The British government had watched as the Ottoman Empire began to reach its cane out and reassert itself, threatening the delicate status quo that Britain had worked so hard to maintain. But inevitably, as the months drew by, the Ottoman campaign against Greece began to falter. Despite early gains, the momentum of the offensive slowed, while Bulgaria, who was a fellow combatant in this excursion but not necessarily an ally, made comparatively greater strides in capturing Greek territory. In December of 1916, as Ottoman forces struggled to maintain their gains in the Aegean, the embattled Sultan Mehmed V faced growing dissent within his own ranks. Sensing an opportunity, the British covertly began to support a liberal nationalist group within the Ottoman Empire that would later be known as the Turkish National Movement. This group of liberal nationalists, disillusioned with the Sultan's leadership, wanted to overthrow the Ottoman government and establish a new, modern state. By aiding these nationalists, Britain wanted to decapitate the Ottoman Empire, ridding it of its sultan and retaining a favorable balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean. With tacit support from the military and British agents working behind the scenes, the Turkish national movement orchestrated a coup that exiled Mehmed V. But the British plan did not unfold as intended. Rather than the Ottoman war plan collapsing into disarray, the new nationalist government doubled down on the war effort. The leaders of the movement, now in control of the Ottoman state, sought to reorganize the military and push back against Greece with renewed vigor. The chaos was getting out of hand by now, so British diplomats moved to negotiate a treaty between Bulgaria and Greece. The treaty, arguably slightly favorable to Greece, granted Bulgaria modest territorial gains in Greek Macedonia, a move designed to keep Bulgaria on side while limiting their expansion. Britain's ultimate goal was actually to collaborate with Bulgaria, who had proven itself a stronger asset than Greece. The British wanted to position themselves to jointly take control of the Bosphorus Strait, and prop up the Bulgarians as a stabilizing force in the region. But the situation, of course, quickly spiraled out of control. Greece lacked the supplies and morale to continue fighting, and with the new Turkish leadership determined to reclaim their lost prestige, the British were forced to take more direct action. They intervened on the side of Greece, deploying their powerful navy to blockade and halt Turkish advances and occupy the coasts of the Bosphorus. The British didn't only have to worry about the Balkans, though. In Central Asia, the so-called Great Game between the British Empire and Russia took on new significance. Without a world war to give Britain and Russia a common enemy in Germany, relations between these two great powers remained tense. The Russian Empire obviously retained control over the vast majority of Central Asia, but the British, too, had their fair share of control over the region. The British Raj extended up to Kashmir and modern-day Pakistan, and British influence extended further north into Afghanistan and southern Iran. Russia and Britain had, since the 19th century, competed over influence in Iran, Afghanistan, and Tibet. But with Russia not focused on war in Europe, the question became whether or not the Russians were planning to turn their sights to Central Asia and attempt to break their way to the Persian Gulf, or worse, try to extend their reach to India. Britain began to formulate plans to protect their interests in Central Asia's rugged terrain, moving more soldiers into Afghanistan and keeping a close eye on Russia's actions. But Russia, as it turns out, was not really focused on Central Asia. While yes, conflict was raging in the Balkans, and the Turks were facing a total institutional collapse, and Serbia was being carved up like China, these reverberations would be a mere tremor compared to the sheer scale of what was about to happen in Russia. To understand the gravity of the situation, we must first take a look back about a decade earlier. The Russian Empire had been shaken to its core by the Revolution of 1905. Tsar Nicholas II had managed to quell the uprising through a combination of force and concessions, most notably the October Manifesto, which promised limited political reforms. But these measures had done little to address the underlying discontent simmering within Russian society. Now, in 1916, with the Tsar having made the decision to forego its commitment to the Serbs 2 years prior, the situation grew even more dire. The Russian peasantry only saw in Nicholas a long line of poor decisions. The church was bewildered by the fact that Nicholas would allow the Orthodox Serbs to come under Catholic Habsburg rule. The liberals and leftists never liked him from the start, but it would be the conservatives who were supposed to be his people, his wing of support, his staunchest defenders. They now turned against him for not standing up to Germany and defending Russia's prestige, Russia's interests. The peasants, the church, the military, the aristocracy, each had their own grievances against Nicholas. And this much was a recipe for disaster. The events that followed would reshape not just the Russian Empire, but would reverberate across the world. Nicholas continued to crack down on protests and riots in the cities, but the playing field had changed. The military was no longer on his side. Disillusioned by Nicholas's perceived weakness and lack of leadership, Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, a supreme commander within the Imperial Russian Army and cousin of the Tsar, began to plot to overthrow him. Alongside Russian Admiral Alexander Kolchak and the backing of powerful dukes like Mikhail and Konstantin, a massive conservative coalition took shape. This coalition, composed of high-ranking military officers and influential aristocrats, demanded that Nicholas II abdicate the throne. Nicholas, of course, refused and ordered the capture and execution of these traitors, but the army was far more loyal to Nikolai and Kolchak. Kolchak moved to occupy St. Petersburg, while Nicholas II was sequestered in Tsarskoye Selo, unaware of the full extent of the conspiracy against him. By the time news reached the young Tsar, he had little choice. He fled to Denmark by way of Estonia, leaving his empire in chaos. How ironic it would be that all of this was started by his cousin Willie and ended by his cousin Nikolai. The leadership crisis just inflated the chaos in Russia in February of 1917. Grand Duke Nikolai was quickly installed as the new Tsar by the military, given his royal blood, but this move only deepened the crisis. The liberals, refusing to recognize Nikolai's legitimacy, took to the streets in protest. Across the vast expanse of the Russian Empire, irredentist movements gained momentum. The various ethnic groups of Russia's domain saw an opportunity now to break away from the weakening central authority. The reaction from the great powers of Europe and beyond was initially that of horror, a horror which went on to fuel a response unlike anything seen on the European continent before. No treaty or formal alliance bound the coalition together, but, not unlike during the Boxer Rebellion in China, this league of strange bedfellows would find themselves working together to prevent Russia's disintegration, all fearing the worst should the resources and territories of Russia fall into the wrong hands. British forces moved by way of Central Asia, occupying Uzbekistan, while other British troops made their way through the Bosphorus up the Dnieper River in an attempt to quell unrest in Kiev. German troops occupied positions in Memel and took to occupying the Polish corridor, forming a block of German-controlled stability along the southern Baltic as the Kaiser's troops marched towards St. Petersburg to restore order. In the far east, Japan occupied the island of Sakhalin, and with the support of the United States and Britain, took de facto control of Vladivostok. The Japanese and Americans, along with Russian forces still loyal to the Tsar Nicholas, would take to occupying the Trans-Siberian Railway, beginning a journey across the vast emptiness of Russia to reach Moscow. Across the board, troops from Austria, Italy, and France aided in the British and German movements towards St. Petersburg and Moscow, while Kolchak and Nikolai waged a campaign of suppression to assert the legitimacy of their new government. The purpose of this international intervention was clear: to restore order in Russia and prevent the balance of power in Europe from tipping into dangerous new territory. But for some powers, this was also an opportunity to secure strategic gains, buffer zones, economic concessions, or territorial acquisitions. As time went on, the fabric of the Russian Empire continued to tear at the seams. A revolution in Siberia spread like wildfire across the vast frozen wilderness, only broken up by American and Japanese-controlled zones along the Trans-Siberian Railway. In the west, the Idel-Ural state was declared among the Volga Tatars and Bashkirs. In the Far East, some movements for independence emerged, but did not find the resources or population to support full-scale secession from Russia, while in the Caucasus, revolts of all kinds erupted, leading to a mess of competing interests and nationalists' armies. By now, though, you're probably wondering where a certain key player in this equation is. Where are the socialists? Where's Lenin? Well, an interesting effect of Russia's neutrality is that there's no basis for Germany to send Vladimir Lenin back to Russia, as they had during World War I in our timeline. By this point, there would certainly be socialist uprisings in Russia, but the question becomes, without Lenin, can they organize and form a coherent vision for the future? Or will they fail, like many other revolutions in history? To answer this, we gotta take a detour, because we must first make note of the unique qualities of Lenin himself. Vladimir Lenin, to his credit, was a relentless intellectual, an organizer, who spent decades shaping the socialist movement in Russia. He was not a charismatic leader who could rally the masses to speeches, but a strategist who consolidated power within his faction and exploited crises to further his revolutionary goals. It was Lenin's maneuvering that led to the split between the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, and brought the Bolsheviks their power, despite the fact that they were, in fact, the smaller of the two socialist groups in Russia. Furthermore, it was his influence that transformed the Soviets from democratic councils into a tool of centralized power. Needless to say, without Lenin, there would have been no Bolsheviks. The various socialist factions in Russia would remain fragmented, debating and deliberating without ever seizing power. With this in mind, our international coalition, as it struggles towards defeating Nikolai, faces a difficult question. Can they restore Nicholas II, perhaps as a constitutional figurehead, or will the vast and disconnected former Russian Empire descend into perpetual chaos? Let me know what you think. If you enjoyed this video or have any critiques or notes, be sure to leave a comment for the algorithm, and subscribe if you really liked hearing about the Austro-Serbian War. You can support us on Patreon by following the link in the description, or by becoming a channel member with the join button below. Thanks for your time. This has been the USFC, signing out.